Carl Jung identified a particular and genuine and mysterious force that occasionally pulls a person away from the comfortable, well-worn paths that the vast majority of people follow throughout their entire lives. Most people, he observed with real and unflinching honesty, take refuge in convention, deciding not through careful moral reasoning, but simply by default, following whatever path the surrounding collective has already laid out, again and again, 9 times out of 10. This is not, in Jung's understanding, a personal failing. It is simply the ordinary and understandable way most human lives actually unfold, guided by necessity and convention rather than by any dramatic, individually chosen destiny. But Jung identified a specific and genuinely different force capable of tipping the scales away from this ordinary conventional path. A force he called vocation, using the word in its oldest and most literal sense. To have a vocation, Jung explained, originally meant to be addressed by a voice, an inner summons that calls a particular person away from the herd and its familiar, well-traveled routes toward a path that only they can hear being asked of them. This voice, when it genuinely appears, acts, in Jung's vivid description, like a law from which there is no real escape, a demand that a person obeys not because it makes obvious practical sense to others, and often not even because it makes obvious practical sense to the person hearing it, but simply because the summons itself carries an authority that ordinary reasoning cannot override. Jung traced this pattern of an inner, private voice through history, citing figures from the ancient prophets who described being directly addressed by a call they could not refuse, to the philosopher Socrates, who spoke openly of an inner voice he called his daimon, guiding and warning him throughout his life, to more recent historical figures who made no secret of feeling the same sense of an inner calling directing their path. Jung was careful to note that this experience of vocation was never limited only to history's most famous and celebrated figures. He insisted it belongs in some form to small personalities just as genuinely as to great ones, though the voice, he observed, tends to grow fainter and more difficult to hear the more a person's life remains fully absorbed into ordinary collective existence. This is where Jung's observation becomes genuinely important for understanding a particular and often painful experience many people have quietly lived through without ever having language for it. He described what happens to a person who is, in his words, called awake by this summons, suddenly and often without warning, set apart from the people around them, confronted with a problem or a pull that the others simply do not share and often cannot even perceive. And Jung was remarkably honest about what tends to happen next. In most cases, he observed, it becomes genuinely difficult, sometimes impossible, to explain to anyone else what has actually happened, because any real understanding on their part is walled off by deeply held assumptions about what counts as legitimate or significant. The person who has heard this inner call is very often met, Jung noted, with a chorus of dismissal, being told bluntly that they are no different from anybody else, that no such inner calling actually exists, or, if its existence is grudgingly admitted at all, that it must be some kind of morbid or unseemly presumption, an entirely inappropriate claim to personal significance. Jung identified a particular and especially frustrating form this dismissal often takes in the modern world, one dressed up in seemingly sophisticated psychological language rather than simple denial. He observed that people are often perfectly willing to acknowledge that psychological experience exists in some general sense, while simultaneously treating anything psychological as merely personal, merely arbitrary, and therefore essentially without any real weight or significance, something that can be freely reshaped, explained away, or dismissed according to whatever is most convenient at the moment. This particular dismissal, treating the inner call as just psychological and therefore not really real in any weighty sense, struck Jung as a curious and genuinely damaging modern blindness, one that fails to recognize that the unconscious mind, from which this kind of genuine calling arises, is not simply a personal fantasy to be conjured and dismissed at will, but represents, for the greater part, something as hard, as immovable, and as genuinely real as any external fact a person might encounter in ordinary waking life. This offers something genuinely important for anyone who has ever felt this particular and often lonely experience, a pull toward a path that the people around them simply do not understand or take seriously, met with exactly the kind of dismissal Jung described, being told there is nothing really there, or that whatever is there is merely personal and therefore insignificant. Jung's understanding suggests that this dismissal, however common and however confidently delivered by well-meaning people, does not actually settle the question of whether a genuine inner calling exists. It simply reflects how difficult this particular kind of experience is to communicate to anyone who has not, themselves, heard something similar. This does not mean that every strong personal impulse or preference automatically qualifies as a genuine vocation in Jung's demanding sense, and he was careful not to inflate the concept so broadly that it lost its genuine meaning. But for those who do experience this particular and unmistakable quality of being addressed by something that feels genuinely larger and more authoritative than ordinary personal preference, Jung's understanding offers real validation, a recognition that this experience, however difficult to explain to others and however often dismissed as merely psychological, may represent one of the most genuinely significant and genuinely real forces available to a human life. Think honestly about whether you have ever experienced this particular quality of inner summons, a pull toward a path that felt less like a preference you were choosing and more like something you were being called toward, whether or not you have ever found the words to fully explain it to the people around you. If you have ever felt this kind of inner calling, right below the single word for the path or the pull it seemed to be pointing you toward, naming it honestly, even if others have dismissed it, is often the first step toward finally taking your own inner voice as seriously as Carl Jung believed it genuinely deserved. Because the private voice that occasionally calls certain people away from the well-worn path everyone else follows was never, in Carl Jung's understanding, merely a personal fantasy to be explained away. It was one of the oldest and most genuinely real forces a human life can encounter. However quietly it speaks, and however loudly the world insists that nothing is really there.